The laughter started before she even reached the line. It wasn't loud, that was the thing about it. It wasn't the kind of laughter that fills a room and announces itself. It was the kind that passes between men who don't need to look at each other to agree. A breath through the nose, a small sound in the throat, a glance that said, "You seeing this?" It was practiced and quiet, and it landed exactly where it was aimed. Sergeant First Class Delia Marsh had heard that sound before. She had heard it in Fort Bragg. She had heard it in Djibouti. She had heard it in a forward operating base outside Kandahar, where the wind tasted like chalk, and the nights dropped 20 degrees in an hour. She had stopped trying to track where it came from. It came from everywhere, and it came from nowhere, and it meant exactly one thing. "You don't belong here." She set her case on the bench and opened the latches without looking up. The range at Fort Cavazos stretched east through a flat, hard-packed basin where the Texas heat pressed down from a white sky. It was the kind of day where distance shimmers and color bleaches out, and a shooter has to trust instruments more than eyes. There were 12 men behind her. She knew this not because she looked, but because she had counted their boots on the gravel walking in. 3 of them were from the 75th Ranger Regiment. 2 were Special Forces. The rest were from her own battalion, Bravo Company, 3rd Infantry. Not a single one had spoken to her directly. The officer who had brought her here, a major named Cutler, had done it with exactly 2 sentences. "You've been requested. Don't embarrass this unit." He had said both sentences while looking at his clipboard. Sergeant Delia Marsh was 34 years old. She had been in the Army for 11 years. She had a combat action badge, 2 Army Commendation medals, and a marksmanship record at Fort Jackson that still hadn't been broken 14 years after she'd set it. She had deployed 3 times. She had qualified expert with every weapon system her MOS required and 4 that it didn't. None of that was what Major Cutler saw when he looked at her. She had long since understood this. Understanding it didn't make it easier. It just made it familiar. She laid the rifle on the bench. It was an M2010 enhanced sniper rifle, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. She had carried this particular rifle for 2 years. She knew its trigger pull to within a fraction of a pound. She knew how it grouped at sea level and how that grouping shifted at altitude. She knew what the barrel felt like when it was running cold versus warm. She had a notebook in her left cargo pocket with 7 pages of data on this rifle: temperature corrections, wind drift tables, scope adjustments for varying densities of air. The notebook was worn at the corners, and the ink had bled in places where sweat had reached it. She had written every entry herself. Behind her, someone said something quietly. Someone else made that sound again. Not quite a laugh, but close enough to serve the same purpose. Sergeant Marsh began her pre-shoot checklist. The problem had started 6 days earlier, though the men who assembled on that range wouldn't have thought of it that way. To them, the problem had started when a target couldn't be neutralized. The chain of causality that led to a 34-year-old woman setting up a rifle on their range while they stood behind her making sounds in their throats. That chain didn't exist to them. They saw only the last link. What had actually happened was this. 3 weeks prior, a reconnaissance element in a classified theater of operations had identified a high-value target operating from a position at distance. The distance was not trivial. The environment was not forgiving. The target had proven adaptable and careful. And by the time sufficient intelligence had been gathered and a window had opened, the window was narrow. 2 attempts had been made through conventional means. Neither had succeeded. The target remained in position. The decision had gone up the chain. It had come back down as a tasking for a long-range precision engagement. Not a mission, a capability assessment first. Before anyone sent a shooter downrange, someone needed to know if the shot was physically possible. That was the number that had circulated through the planning rooms and had caused men to go quiet. 1,900 meters, not record-setting by the standards of documented military engagements. The longest confirmed sniper shot in history had been made by a Ukrainian soldier named Kowalski, a 58-year-old man who had settled around at 4,007 meters in a conflict that had rewritten what most people thought physics would allow. Before that, a Canadian Special Forces operator had held the record at 3,400 meters. The books had been rewritten more than once in the last decade by men shooting under conditions that had no business producing accurate fire. 1,900 meters was not a record, but it was serious work. 11 shooters had attempted it on a simulated version of the environmental conditions over the previous 4 days. Rangers, Special Forces, One JSOC-attached precision fire specialist who had been brought in from a training cadre in Virginia. They had shot at a target, replicating the approximate size and position of the high-value individual at the correct distance under constructed wind and elevation conditions derived from the theater data. 9 of the 11 had missed. 2 had hit, but not with the consistency that the mission required. A single hit probability wasn't enough. What was needed was someone who could demonstrate a pattern, multiple engagements at distance, under variable conditions, with a hit rate that justified the operational risk of putting a shooter in position. The commanding general was a 2-star named Hadfield. He had served 31 years. He had deployed 7 times. He was not a man who asked questions he already knew the answers to, and he was not a man who tolerated process for its own sake. When the numbers from the 4-day assessment came back to him, he sat with them for a long time. Then he asked one question. "Is there anyone else?" The officer who answered was a colonel named Strawn. Strawn had commanded a ranger battalion before his current posting. He was the kind of man who moved carefully through rooms and watched exits. He said the name of a unit. Within that unit, he said there was a soldier who held certain scores. He said this the way a man admits something he would have preferred not to. General Hadfield looked at him for a moment. "Get her out here." Sergeant Marsh had not been told any of this. She had been told, "You are reporting to Range 7 at Fort Cavazos at 600 on Tuesday. Bring your gear." She had asked Major Cutler what the purpose of the range session was, and Cutler had said, "That's above my pay grade." Sergeant in a tone that suggested he found the entire situation mildly distasteful. She had driven to the range before dawn and arrived when the sky was still dark in the west and orange only at the edges. She had set up her equipment alone, the way she always did. Nobody had offered to help, and she hadn't expected them to. The other shooters had arrived in groups. She had watched them in her peripheral vision as she ran her maintenance checks. They had looked at her the way people look at something that doesn't fit the expected landscape, briefly, then away, then back again. Some of them already knew each other. There was the easy familiarity of shared deployments, of shared training cycles, of belonging to something together. None of it included her, a warrant officer named Dax. She caught the name off a conversation not meant for her, had said something to the man next to him, and the man had made that sound, and then they had both looked at the ground. Marsh had turned back to her rifle. She was not angry. That surprised her sometimes when she examined it closely, that she had moved past anger years ago and landed somewhere else. Not acceptance exactly, not indifference. Something more like a long, clear-eyed recognition that the problem was not hers to fix. She could not change what these men saw when they looked at her. She could not revise their assumptions. She could not make herself legible to them in any way that would matter before the first round fired. All she could do was shoot, and she could shoot very well. The range safety officer called the line to order and ran through the standard briefing. Wind from the northwest at 9 miles per hour. Temperature 81 degrees. Barometric pressure read at 29.34 inches of mercury. The targets were steel silhouettes at distance markers ranging from 800 to 1900 meters. The assessment would proceed in stages. Each shooter would engage designated targets in sequence. Scoring was mechanical, a hit registered as an audible strike that a spotter would confirm. There were no formal introductions. Nobody announced what each person was there for. The range safety officer spoke with the bland efficiency of someone who had run 1,000 briefings and understood that the briefing was not the point. Sergeant Marsh settled into her position. The first stage was 800 meters. This was, by precision rifle standards, a moderate distance. It required attention, but not extraordinary skill from a trained marksman. The point of it was calibration, scope verification, environmental read, confirmation that the data in the notebook matched what the conditions were actually doing. She fired 3 rounds, 3 hits. The steel rang each time with a sound that carried back to the line a half second after the trigger broke. She didn't look up. Behind her, nothing happened. No comment. The other shooters went in sequence. Most of them also hit at 800. The stage ended and the range officer called them forward to the next distance. 1,200 meters. Here, a few misses entered the picture. Wind was doing something subtle at mid-range, not the reading at the line, which was clean, but something in the terrain beyond a low rise in the ground that bent the air slightly. Marsh had noted the tall grass at the 400-meter mark before the range session began. She had spent 15 minutes watching it move. She had made a notation, she adjusted. 3 rounds, 3 hits. She heard the warrant officer Dax miss twice on his second stage. She did not react to this. She made a minor adjustment to her data card and went back into her position. 1,500 meters. This was where the assessment had been separating people. At 1,500, the variables compounded. A small wind error became a large miss. A trigger pull that was acceptable at shorter distances became the deciding factor. The shooter's breathing cycle became a negotiation with physics rather than an afterthought. Two of the Rangers had reached their ceiling at this distance on prior days. The Special Forces precision specialist from Virginia, according to what Marsh had overheard, had had his best performance here. Marsh went through her ritual. She did not hurry. She found her position, found her breathing, found the place inside the shot that she had learned to find years ago on a range in South Carolina when her instructor, a staff sergeant named Weir, had told her that the rifle doesn't know who's holding it. The rifle doesn't care about you, Weir had said. It only knows what you tell it with your body. She told it carefully. 3 rounds, 3 hits. There was a pause after the third one. Not dramatic, just a moment where the normal background sounds of the range seemed to thin. Then the spotter's confirmation came over the radio, and the range officer called for the line to stand by for the final stage. 1,900 meters. At 1,900 meters, the bullet would be in the air for approximately 2.5 seconds before it reached the target. In that time, it would drop roughly 72 inches from the line of bore. The wind running at 9 miles per hour would push it laterally somewhere between 8 and 14 inches, depending on what it encountered at mid-flight. The temperature and pressure would affect its ballistic coefficient. The Earth's rotation would introduce a small but real Coriolis effect. Negligible to some shooters, not negligible to Sergeant Marsh, who had the calculation in her notebook. She had run these numbers the night before. She had run them in her apartment with a small table fan in the window and a cup of coffee going cold on the desk beside her. She had run them again in the car on the way out, doing the math in her head as the highway lights passed overhead in the dark. She ran them once more now, quietly, while the other shooters settled into position, and the spotter confirmed target orientation, and the range officer ran through his final check. None of the men behind her had spoken to her about the shot. None of them had asked what data she was using or how she intended to account for the wind gradient. This was fine. She hadn't expected them to. The line went quiet. Marsh put her eye to the scope. The steel target at 1,900 meters was nearly invisible without magnification. A dark mark against pale earth, smaller than a thumbnail, held at arm's length. Through the scope, it resolved into a rectangle of worn metal. There was a slight heat shimmer at ground level. She breathed out slowly. She had thought once that she would be nervous in moments like this. She had been nervous early in her career when the expectation of others was a weight she couldn't set down. What had changed was not her confidence exactly, but her relationship to the moment itself. The moment didn't care about the men behind her. The shot didn't know about the sounds they made. The distance was the same distance regardless of who was watching. She found the rhythm. Inhale, exhale halfway. Hold. She had been here before. Not this range, not this target, but this particular stillness inside the noise of circumstance. She had been here in training and in deployment and in the quiet of her own preparation. This was the place that all the hours built toward. Every notebook entry, every data point, every round she had put downrange in the 4 years. Since she had begun developing this skill deliberately, rather than incidentally, it had all been construction. It had all been building this. She squeezed the trigger, the rifle fired, 2.5 seconds, the steel rang. Nobody spoke immediately. That was what she noticed first, not the confirmation from the spotter, which came 3 seconds later and was technically redundant, but the silence that preceded it. Not the comfortable silence of men who had agreed in advance to be quiet, the other kind. The kind that arrives when what has happened doesn't fit the shape of what was expected. The spotter said, confirmed, 1,900, hit. The range officer marked it. Marsh came out of her position deliberately, rolling her shoulder and taking a breath. She checked the bolt, confirmed the chamber was clear, and laid the rifle on the bench with the barrel pointing downrange. Procedure. She had followed it thousands of times, and she followed it now, here, because procedure didn't change based on audience. She heard someone behind her say something quietly. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't try. A second round was called. Standard practice at distance, one hit could be anomalous. Patterns were evidence. She went back into position. The wind had shifted slightly at the line. A change in the way it moved against the exposed skin of her neck. She made an adjustment of 1 click. Breathe, fired. 2.5 seconds, steel rang. Third round, same process. Minor variation in the adjustment. The wind had come back slightly toward its original bearing. She split the difference. The spotter confirmed the third hit 30 seconds after it landed. Marsh sat up. She began field stripping the scope turret for a log entry, moving through the motions the way she always did after an engagement, writing down the final confirmed adjustments and comparing them to the morning predictions. She did not look at the men behind her. She had never required their reaction to close the loop on her own performance. The performance was the record. The record stood regardless of whether anyone chose to read it. She was finishing her notation when she heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. She knew, from the weight and cadence of them, that it was more than one person. General Hadfield was not a large man. He stood perhaps 5'10" and had the lean, controlled build of someone who had always treated physical readiness as a professional obligation rather than a choice. He had gray at his temples and a face that had spent enough time in high desert sun to carry it permanently. He walked like someone who had made decisions in difficult rooms for a long time and had stopped being impressed by difficulty. He stopped 2 feet behind the bench where Marsh was still writing in her notebook. She became aware of him before she heard him. A shift in the atmosphere of the range, a change in how the other men around her were holding themselves. She set down her pen and turned. She had not known the general would be here. Nobody had told her. She came to attention. At ease, he said quietly. Not a performance. Just words. He looked at her notebook. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the data card she had set beside it. You made all 3? Yes, sir. At 1900. Yes, sir. He was the silence of a man formulating a reaction, but the silence of one who had already formed it and was simply holding it for a moment before speaking. How long have you been working this distance? Approximately 3 years, sir. The last 18 months consistently in this environmental bracket. He nodded. Walk me through the third adjustment. She picked up the data card. She was calm. This was what the preparation was for. Not just the shot, but the explanation of the shot. The ability to show the work. She laid out the wind gradient calculation, the mid-range terrain effect, the temperature correction she had applied, and why the Coriolis calculation and the decision she had made it to include it rather than round it off. Hadfield listened. He asked one question. About the wind gradient methodology, and she answered it. He nodded again, with the quality of a man who recognizes what he's hearing. The range behind them had gone very quiet. She heard in the silence the absence of the sound that had been there before. The sound that passed between men who didn't need to look at each other to agree. It wasn't gone because they had revised their assumptions about her. She wasn't naive enough to think that. It was gone because, for the moment, the data had overtaken the assumption, and the data was very loud. Where did you learn to do this? Hadfield asked. I've had good instructors, sir, and I've had a lot of time on the range. Who's your best instructor? She thought about it. A staff sergeant named Weir, sir. He taught me that the rifle doesn't know who's holding it. Something moved across Hadfield's face. Not quite a smile. That's right, he said. He looked at the rifle again, then at her, Sergeant Marsh. He said it without inflection. You're going to need to come with me. She learned the rest of the picture in a briefing room an hour later, in a building with no windows and a door that required a code. Colonel Strawn was there. 2 intelligence officers she had never met were there. A mission planner, whose name she was given and immediately stored away, was there. Hadfield sat at the end of the table and let Strawn run through the situation, and she listened without expression, logging every detail, cross-referencing it against things she already knew and things she was learning now. 1,900 meters, variable wind, mountainous terrain, single window of opportunity, 2 prior failures, 1 shot needed, possibly 2. The intelligence officer used a pointer and a map. He gave her the elevation and the atmospheric data from the theater. He told her the window was 72 hours out. He told her that a precision element was in place and that she would be integrating with them. She asked about the terrain data resolution, and they gave her what they had. She asked about the temperature differential between target elevation and firing position, and one of the intelligence officers made a note and said he would get her the numbers. She asked about the spotter's qualification at distance, and Strawn said the spotter was a ranger sergeant named Elroy with 2 confirmed long-distance observations in theater. She made her own notes. Nobody in the room treated her the way the men on the range had. Whether this was because Hadfield was in the room or because the situation had selected for people who understood what the numbers meant. She couldn't say. It didn't matter. She wasn't here for the treatment. She was here for the work. When the briefing ended, Hadfield stopped her at the door. "Sergeant," he said, "I'm going to ask you something." She waited. "The men on that range this morning. You know what that was like? You've known what that was like for a long time, I expect." It wasn't a question exactly. She answered it anyway. "Yes, sir. And you're still here?" "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment, in the way that very senior people sometimes look at someone they have just fully understood for the first time. "Then let's get you out there," he said. She flew out 43 hours later on a cargo flight that stopped twice before reaching its destination, which she had been told she would not be required to name. She slept on the flight, as she always did when she could. Sleep was a resource like water and ammunition to be consumed when available. She arrived before dawn and was transported to the position by vehicle and then on foot, up a slope that took 2 hours to climb in the dark, carrying 90 pounds of equipment. The position was a rocky notch in the face of a ridge, covered from above by an overhang and from the sides by 2 large boulders that had come to rest, at angles that suggested, if you were the kind of person who noticed such things, that the mountain had been here long enough to form opinions about geometry. Sergeant Elroy was already there. He was a compact, quiet man who shook her hand without ceremony and immediately began going through the environmental data he had collected over the previous 36 hours. He had a spotting scope and a Kestrel weather station, and a notebook that was, she noticed, in the same condition as hers. Worn at the corners, the ink blurred in places by the elements. She liked him immediately. She didn't say so. They spent 4 hours at the position before the window opened. 4 hours of data collection, position refinement, range verification, communication with the ground element, communication checks with the command post. She ate a protein bar at some point. She drank water. She did not sleep. Neither did Elroy. They talked only when speech was necessary, and when it was necessary, they were efficient. He confirmed ranges. She noted corrections. He updated her on the wind pattern. It was running from the south-southeast at the position, with a cross component at mid-range that he had been tracking for stabilized and was now confident had calculations. He checked them. They agreed. "You been out here before?" he asked once during a pause. "Not this specific place. Different place, same feeling?" She thought about it. "Yeah." He nodded and went back to his scope. The window opened at 0340. The target appeared in Elroy's observation field at 0342. He gave her the confirmation. She had been in position for 11 minutes, settled and still, her eye to the scope, her body in the rifle, her breathing in its rhythm. She had been ready for this exact moment. Since the first morning she'd picked up a rifle and discovered, with a clarity that felt almost accidental, that this was something she was made for. She made a final correction. The wind at the position had given a small shift at 0341. She had felt it, and Elroy had confirmed it, and she had already moved the turret a quarter click in response. She breathed. Exhale halfway. Hold. The distance was 1,920 meters. She had done the calculation for this exact distance at this exact atmospheric reading 3 times in the previous hour. She knew what the bullet needed to do. She had described it to the rifle in the language the rifle understood, which was the language of data and mechanics and the accumulated knowledge of every round she had ever put downrange. She fired. The bullet traveled for 2.5 seconds. Elroy was on the scope. "Hit," he said. He said it the way he said everything, without decoration, without volume, without drama. Just the word, flat and precise like a data point. She did not move. She stayed in her position, reset, breathed. "Confirm?" she asked. "Good effect." She exhaled the rest of the breath. Outside, the sky was still dark. The wind moved across the ridge in its long, indifferent way. The way it had been moving across that particular piece of ground for 10,000 years before any of them arrived, and would continue to move for 10,000 years after they left. She came out of her position slowly. She logged the final data in her notebook. Time, distance, wind correction, confirmed outcome. She noted the quarter-click adjustment made at 0341 and the final setting on the turret. She wrote the temperature and the pressure reading from Elroy's Kestrel. She wrote the time of the confirmed hit. Then she closed the notebook. Elroy was already on the radio, reporting to the command post. She listened to his voice in the dark. Calm, professional, factual, confirmed engagement, single round, good effect. Time 0344. She began the process of packing her position, Systematic, unhurried, the way she always packed out. Every brass casing, every piece of equipment logged and secured. She had learned early in her career that how you leave a position says as much about your professionalism as how you perform in it. The response came back from the command post 4 minutes later. She heard it in her earpiece. Command copies. Outstanding work, not addressed to her by name. To the position, the element, the function she represented, that was fine. She had not come here to be addressed by name. She had come here to do something that needed to be done, and that, as it turned out, only she had been able to do. Elroy handed her a piece of hard candy from his cargo pocket as they began the descent. It was, she realized as she put it in her mouth, spearmint. She hadn't had spearmint candy in years. She didn't know why that struck her as significant, but it did, the ordinary smallness of it against the dark and the altitude and the weight of the last 4 hours. They walked down the slope in silence, picking their way by moonlight and the small glow of a red filter headlamp Elroy wore tilted down toward the ground. The mountain rose above them and fell away below them, and the sky was beginning, at its very eastern edge, to reconsider the dark. She thought about the range at Fort Cavazos. She thought about the men standing behind her and the sound they had made. She thought about Major Cutler and his clipboard and his 2 sentences. She thought about General Hadfield standing at the door of the briefing room, looking at her with that quality of final understanding. She did not think about these things with anger. She had moved past anger a long time ago. What she thought about them now was something closer to acknowledgement. A simple recognition that all of it had led here, to this hillside, in the dark, the notebook in her left cargo pocket, and the rifle on her back, and 11 years of preparation that had never been wasted, not once, even when it had felt like it might be. The data didn't lie, the rifle didn't care who was holding it, and the shot, once confirmed, was simply the truth, clear and unambiguous, and no longer subject to anyone else's permission to be what it was. She walked down the mountain.